The train screamed into the valley like a wounded animal, its whistle slicing through the quiet Christmas Eve air. Steam billowed out across the platform, mingling with the falling snow until the world became nothing but white breath and ghostly echoes. Out of that fog stepped a young woman wrapped in a patchwork shawl of rags and faded silk, her face half hidden beneath a travel-stained scarf. Her name was Li Mei, 23 years old, bones thin from hunger, hands trembling not from cold but from all the things she'd already lost before this day. The townsfolk stood still as if a ghost had walked among them. Men with calloused hands, women with frostbitten cheeks, children clutching peppermint sticks, all turned to stare. Someone whispered, "That's the bride from California. The Chinaman's woman." Laughter cracked the silence. A man spat tobacco into the snow. Still, Li Mei kept her eyes low, her back straight, clutching the handle of her tiny trunk as though it held her last piece of life. The man who came to claim her was late. By the time he arrived, dusk had settled like ash over the station. He stumbled down the platform, Harold Pike, a broad, red-faced ranch hand in a dirty sheepskin coat. The sour smell of whiskey followed him. He looked her up and down once, a flicker of disgust twisting his mouth. "You're smaller than I was told," he muttered. "An older-looking dot." He yanked open her trunk, pawed through her few belongings, a cracked comb, a silk ribbon, a letter written in Chinese. "Ain't what I paid for," he said and kicked the trunk shut. His voice rose, sharp enough for everyone to hear. "You can keep her. She's not worth the postage." Then he turned and walked away into the drifting snow. For a moment no one moved. The platform lanterns flickered, wind whispering through the cracks of wooden boards. Li Mei stood frozen, her breath shallow, her heart pounding like a small animal's. Someone laughed again, nervous, cruel. A woman whispered, "Poor thing," but didn't step closer. Another muttered, "Ought to go back where she came from." Li Mei's lips parted, but no words came. The English she had learned on the ship scattered from her mind like birds startled from a branch. She bent slowly, gathering her things, the thin silk sleeves of her dress darkening with melting snow. The letter slipped from her trunk and drifted away, her sister's handwriting disappearing under boot prints and white dust. She reached out, but a gust of wind carried it farther into the street. She watched until it vanished completely. That was when she understood. She had nowhere left to go. She walked. Past the saloon where laughter spilled through swinging doors. Past the general store with its glowing windows and wreaths of pine. Her shoes, thin and cracked, left faint prints that filled with snow almost as soon as she moved on. Every face that looked at her seemed to turn away just as quickly. In the distance the church bell tolled, soft, mournful. Somewhere people were singing hymns about mercy and light. She wrapped her shawl tighter, but it did little against the wind that bit through her bones. Her knees buckled before she reached the end of the street. The snow had grown thick, heavy. She sank beside the church steps, lowering her head against the stone. For a long while she listened to the sound of her own breath, shallow, breaking, and thought of home. Of the jasmine trees near the river. Of her mother's hands weaving red thread through her hair. She whispered something in her native tongue, a prayer perhaps, though even she wasn't sure who could hear her now. Across the street the last shop light dimmed. The night deepened. The whole town turned away from her, letting the wind bury the stranger who had arrived too late, too poor, too foreign for anyone's comfort. Then came the crunch of boots on snow. At first she thought it was Harold returning, or one of the men from the saloon come to laugh at her. But the steps were slow, steady, deliberate. A shadow moved through the storm, tall, broad-shouldered, carrying a lantern in one hand and leading a horse in the other. The light swung across the churchyard, catching the edge of his coat, the outline of a weathered face. He stopped a few feet away, studying the figure half buried in white. He saw the faint rise and fall of her chest. He saw the way her fingers still clutched the strap of her trunk. For a long moment he said nothing. The lantern light flickered between them like a heartbeat. "You'll freeze out here," he said finally, his voice low, unhurried, worn by years of solitude. Li Mei blinked up, her vision blurred. She saw only shapes, a man's outline against the storm, the faint glint of snow melting in his beard. He set down the lantern and knelt beside her. The horse whinnied softly behind him, breath steaming in the cold. He touched her shoulder lightly as though afraid she might shatter. "Can you stand?" he asked. She didn't understand the words, but his tone, gentle, not pitying, reached her. She tried to rise, but her body betrayed her. He caught her before she fell, strong arms lifting her easily. Her head rested against his chest for a moment. She could hear the steady rhythm of his heart beneath the layers of wool and flannel. It was the first warmth she'd felt in weeks. The man looked toward the houses. Lights glowed behind frosted windows, families gathered around hearths. None of them saw what he saw, the small, shivering figure in his arms, her breath like fog, her skin too pale to belong to the living. He shifted his hold and started toward the road leading out of town. Snowflakes settled on her dark hair, glinting in the lantern's light like fallen stars. She whispered something, a name maybe or a word he couldn't understand. He only nodded, his jaw tightening against the cold. "We'll find warmth soon," he murmured almost to himself. By the time they reached the edge of town, the storm had thickened into a curtain. The world behind them vanished. All that remained was the crunch of his boots, the creak of the saddle, and the faint flicker of the lantern swinging between them. The woman in his arms had fallen silent, her face pressed to his coat, her lashes dusted with frost. He looked down once, briefly, at the delicate curve of her cheek, the thin scar near her lip, the bruises half hidden by her scarf, and something in him shifted. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story. But he knew the look of someone the world had already given up on. He had seen it once before in the mirror the winter his wife died. When the church bells rang again in the distance, their sound faint through the snow, he kept walking. The light from his lantern grew smaller and smaller until it was only a dim glow moving through the darkness, one lonely flame carrying two souls toward the unknown. And behind them, on the empty platform, the wind lifted a scrap of paper from the snow, a torn corner of a letter written in another tongue. It fluttered in the cold until it caught against a lamppost, the ink smeared but legible enough to whisper a single word: home. When Li Mei opened her eyes, the world was made of warmth and woodlight. A slow fire whispered in the hearth, throwing amber over rough cabin walls and the outline of a man sitting by the door with his hat in his hands. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, a hollow sound that made her think of faraway bells. She tried to move, but a wool blanket slid from her shoulders and her arm trembled. The man turned at the motion. He had the kind of face the wilderness carves, stern lines softened by quiet eyes. "You're safe," he said, his voice low, patient. She understood only the tone, not the words. Her throat was dry. She nodded once, cautious, like a wild creature unsure of human mercy. He rose and poured water into a tin cup, handing it to her. His hand was rough, the palm scarred, but his movements were steady as if he'd spent a lifetime mending broken things. She drank slowly. Her reflection rippled in the cup, pale skin, tangled hair, the shadow of yesterday's shame. The door creaked and a small boy peered in, freckled cheeks, straw-colored hair sticking up. He carried a wooden horse and stared with wide curiosity. "Pa," he whispered, "she's awake." Samuel Whitaker nodded to his son. "This here's Thomas," he said, then gestured toward himself, touching his chest. "Samuel." Li Mei caught the rhythm of the words, repeating softly, "Samuel." Her accent shaped it like music. Then she pressed her hand to her chest. "May." The boy smiled shyly. "Like a flower," he murmured, though she didn't know what he said. The cabin smelled of pine smoke and something cooking, cornbread perhaps, or stew. Samuel moved to the stove and ladled soup into a bowl, setting it beside her. Steam curled upward, carrying the scent of beans and salt pork. She hesitated before lifting the spoon. Hunger overruled pride. Thomas leaned closer, his voice curious. "Where's she from?" Samuel didn't answer right away. He watched Li Mei eat, each motion careful, almost ceremonial. "Far away," he said finally. "Farther than we'll ever ride." That night, when the wind clawed at the windows and the snow piled against the door, Li Mei couldn't sleep. The cabin groaned like an old ship in a storm. She sat by the fire, sewing the tear in her sleeve with a thin needle from her pocket. The rhythm soothed her. Samuel sat across from her, mending a bridle, his eyes half-shadowed. They worked in silence, two strangers bound by the same rhythm, the steady patience of repair. In the morning, light bled through the frost on the windows. Samuel had already gone out to chop wood, his axe echoing through the stillness. Thomas fed the chickens, singing to himself. Li Mei found her strength enough to rise and sweep the floor. Each gesture, small and precise, was a prayer for belonging. When Samuel came in, snow dusted his coat. He paused, watching her tidy the corner table. "You don't have to," he said softly. She didn't understand, but she caught the shape of refusal in his tone and shook her head, pointing to herself. Work was language enough. By noon, she had washed the dishes, folded blankets, and hung herbs by the window. The house, once plain and cold, began to look gently alive again. Thomas followed her like a shadow, offering her buttons, nails, bits of twine. his way of helping. After dinner, a knock came. Samuel opened the door to a tall woman wrapped in a gray shawl, hair streaked with white, his mother, Martha Whitaker. Her eyes swept the room, then landed on Li Mei. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Li Mei bowed slightly, unsure of what to do. Martha's voice was careful. "You took her in?" Samuel nodded. "Found her near the church. Would have frozen if I hadn't." Martha's gaze softened despite herself. "It's kind of you. But folks are already talking. You know how small towns are." "I know," he said quietly, "but talks never kept a person alive." Martha looked back at Li Mei, who stood by the hearth, hands clasped, eyes lowered. The older woman studied her delicate posture, the faint bruises on her wrist, the quiet courage that clung to her like light. "Does she understand you?" "Some," Samuel said. "She'll understand kindness faster than words," Martha murmured, setting a small loaf of bread on the table. "Let her eat. Let her rest." When Martha left, Li Mei took a deep breath and sat near the window. Snow had stopped falling, leaving a pale hush over the land. Samuel joined her, resting his elbows on the sill. "She's right," he said, though she couldn't know it. "Talk's gonna start. Folks don't take kindly to what they don't understand." She turned toward him, sensing the weight in his tone. Her eyes, dark, calm, unreadable, met his. She pressed her hand to her chest again, then to the cabin walls as if saying thank you. Samuel's reply was a small nod, his expression unreadable but full of something that could almost be trust. Days folded into one another. She learned to light the stove, to chop vegetables, to feed the horses with Thomas's help. Sometimes she sang softly, songs of rivers and moonlight that made the boy stop and listen, eyes wide, as though he'd found a secret door into another world. Samuel worked long hours outside, fixing fences and hauling logs, yet each time he returned, the sight of smoke curling from the chimney eased something inside him. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It breathed again. Still, the outside world had long ears. When Samuel rode into town one afternoon, men at the store leaned close, whispering. "Whitaker's got himself a new woman," one said. "A foreign one at that." Another laughed. "Guess even the lonely ones need company." Samuel didn't answer. He loaded his supplies, paid in silence, and rode home through falling snow. That evening when he entered, Li Mei looked up from the hearth. She'd mended Thomas's torn jacket, the stitches neat as lace. She smiled faintly, offering it to Samuel for approval. He took it, fingers brushing hers for a second longer than needed. The air trembled with something unspoken. He wanted to tell her the things he'd heard, to warn her of the cruelty that brewed behind polite smiles, but when he saw her face, calm, steady, shining faintly in the firelight, he couldn't. Instead, he only said, "Good work." She caught the words, repeating softly, "Good work." That night, snow began again, soft as feathers. Thomas fell asleep early, his hand curled around his wooden horse. Li Mei sat near the window, humming to the rhythm of the wind. Samuel stood by the door, staring into the storm. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the ache of absence that haunted the cabin. Yet that small peace carried its own danger. As he turned to bank the fire, he saw her tracing something in the frost of the window pane. A single Chinese character, simple and fluid. He didn't know what it meant, but the way she looked at it made him feel as though he should. She noticed him watching and wiped it away quickly, embarrassed. He stepped closer, voice quiet. "What was it?" She hesitated, then whispered the word, soft and unsure, "Home." He stood there for a long moment, the word sinking deep. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying snow against the glass like tiny fists. Inside, the silence between them changed. No longer emptiness, but the fragile beginning of something that could shatter or bloom. And somewhere beyond that storm, in a tavern's lamplit corner, Harold Pike lifted his glass and muttered to his companions, "That Chinawoman's livin' with Whitaker now." Laughter erupted around him, low and mean, like thunder rolling over ice. The storm outside deepened, but it was not the snow Samuel would have to face next. It was the town. The thaw began early that year, a slow surrender of winter's hold. Snow melted from the eaves in rhythmic drips, and the creek behind Samuel's cabin began to sing again. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth, but inside the house, the quiet had thickened into something fragile. Li Mei could feel it, the way the townsfolk's whispers had seeped into Samuel's silence, the way he paused before going into town now, his jaw set like a man bracing against wind. Each morning she rose before the sun. She boiled water, stirred porridge, and folded Thomas's clothes beside the fire. Her body moved with practiced grace, yet her eyes carried the weariness of someone always waiting for the ground to give way beneath her. Thomas chattered as he ate, telling stories of sleds and snowmen, and she smiled for him. But when Samuel returned from the barn, she saw the dirt on his boots and the way he avoided her gaze, and her smile faltered. That afternoon, he brought in a bundle of firewood and spoke more sharply than he meant to. "You don't have to do everything," he said. "You're a guest here." Li Mei froze, the broom still in her hands. The word guest stung, though she couldn't have translated it if asked. She bowed her head and murmured, "Yes." But her eyes dimmed like the fire's last embers. Samuel saw it, regretted it immediately, but said nothing. Words were dangerous things when one couldn't be sure they'd be understood. By evening, the sky turned violet. Samuel rode into town for supplies, leaving her and Thomas alone. She watched him disappear over the hill, his figure small against the fading light. When the wind picked up, she went outside to gather laundry from the line. That was when she noticed the figures. 3 men standing by the fence, hats low, voices carrying laughter too harsh to be friendly. "Well, look at that," one drawled. "Whitaker's got himself a little foreign wife." Li Mei gripped the sheet tighter, her pulse pounding. She couldn't understand their words, but their tone, mocking, cruel, was universal. One man spat into the dirt, another stepped closer, holding out a coin as if to tempt a beggar. Thomas appeared in the doorway. "Pa ain't here," he said, his voice trembling. "You best leave." The men only laughed louder. One reached out, tugging at the edge of Li Mei's shawl. "Pretty cloth," he said. "Bet she came with a price." Thomas ran for the rifle hanging above the hearth, but before he could reach it, hoofbeats thundered down the road. Samuel's horse burst into view, snow kicking up beneath its hooves. His face was carved from fury. He leapt down before the horse stopped moving, grabbed the man by the collar, and slammed him against the fence. "You touch her again," he said low and even, "and I'll bury you right here in my field." The man choked out a laugh, though fear flickered behind it. "Easy there, Whitaker. We were just having fun. Ain't she the one Pike ordered in?" Samuel's fist tightened. "She's not anyone's to order." The men muttered something and retreated, boots crunching over thawed mud. When they were gone, the only sound was Samuel's heavy breathing and the faint whimper of the horse. He turned to Li Mei. She stood frozen, shawl clutched tight, eyes wide but dry. Thomas hid behind her skirt, small and shaken. Samuel's anger melted into guilt. "They won't bother you again?" he said, voice rough. She didn't answer. Instead, she gathered the scattered laundry and carried it inside, her steps steady but distant. Later, when the fire had burned low, she sat alone by the window, staring into the dark. Samuel lingered by the door, torn between apology and pride. "I shouldn't have left," he said softly. "This town," he stopped himself. "They don't understand what kindness means anymore." She looked at him then, her eyes reflecting the firelight like dark glass. Slowly, she reached for the mended coat on the chair, the one she'd sewn for him. She held it out. "Work," she said, placing it in his hands. Then she touched her heart. "Thank." It was all she could give, a peace offering from one soul to another. He nodded, throat tight, and took the coat. Days passed, the incident fading like footprints in snow, but something between them had changed. Samuel spoke less. Li Mei grew quieter too, though her silence was not emptiness, it was endurance. The townspeople's cruelty had marked her, but it had not broken her. One morning she ventured into town alone. Samuel had gone to mend a neighbor's fence, and Thomas was at the creek chasing frogs. She needed thread and rice. Her shawl fluttered in the cold wind as she walked down Main Street. Heads turned. Conversations hushed. The storekeeper, a gray-haired woman named Mrs. Owens, looked startled when Li Mei stepped inside. "I'm looking for Samuel's boy," Mrs. Owens said, flustered as though speaking to a child. "You his help." Li Mei hesitated, then pointed to herself. "Li Mei. Friend." The woman's expression softened, though confusion lingered. She filled the order, sliding the items across the counter without another word. But as Li Mei turned to leave, a familiar voice cut through the air. "Well, I'll be damned." Harold Pike leaned against the doorframe, a bottle in hand. His grin was wide and hateful. "Didn't figure you'd crawl out of whatever hole he stuffed you in." Li Mei stiffened, clutching her parcel to her chest. "You remember me, don't you?" he said. "You were supposed to be mine. Cost me good money, that letter to the broker. And look at you now, settled and fine with the farmer." Mrs. Owens snapped, "That's enough, Pike." He ignored her. "You think Whitaker's any better? He'll toss you out soon as he tires of the novelty." The room blurred at the edges. Li Mei backed toward the door, shaking her head. Pike reached for her wrist, fingers like iron. "You ain't going anywhere." Then a voice thundered from outside. "Let her go." Samuel stood in the doorway, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. Pike hesitated, then sneered. "You think she's worth all this trouble?" Samuel's answer came with a clenched jaw. "More than you'll ever understand." He stepped between them, pulling Li Mei gently behind him. Pike muttered curses but stumbled away, the bottle falling and shattering on the step. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by Li Mei's ragged breathing. Samuel turned to her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You all right?" he asked. She didn't understand the words, but she felt them. Her lips trembled, she nodded. When they left town, no one met their eyes. Snow began again, light and slow. Samuel's horse carried them both, Li Mei clinging to the back of his coat. Her head rested against his shoulder. He could feel her heartbeat against his spine, quick but steady. As they crossed the hill toward home, the wind carried a faint scent of burning wood. Samuel turned in the saddle. Smoke rose in the distance, thin, gray, twisting upward from the direction of his cabin. Li Mei gasped, clutching his arm. Samuel's pulse surged. He spurred the horse faster, snow spraying beneath its hooves. The closer they drew, the clearer the sight became. Flames licking the edge of the barn, smoke curling through the rafters. The boy was still inside. Smoke clawed at the sky like a dark hand. Samuel's heart thundered as he drove the horse harder up the slope, the cabin shrinking and shifting through waves of heat. The closer they came, the sharper the air turned, the acrid bite of burning hay, the low screams of panicked horses. Li Mei clung to him from behind, her nails digging through his coat. Her voice was a cry without language, a sound pulled from fear's deepest well. He leapt from the saddle before it stopped moving. Thomas's shrill voice carried from the barn. "Pa!" The door stuck. Samuel ran through the smoke, his lungs filling with fire. The door glowed orange from the inside, hinges squealing against the pressure of flame. He threw his shoulder into it once, twice, then again until the wood splintered. Heat slammed against him like a living thing. Thomas stood inside, eyes wide, clutching the reins of a terrified mare. "Go!" Samuel shouted, dragging him out into the open. The horse bolted past them, vanishing into the snow. But behind them another sound rose, a coughing gasp. Li Mei had followed, her small figure half hidden in the haze. She darted toward the stalls, her shawl trailing behind her like a streak of red smoke. "Li Mei, no!" Samuel roared, but she was already inside, fumbling at the knots of a trapped colt. Her hair had come loose, her face streaked with soot, eyes stinging yet unwavering. The flames danced along the rafters, creaking overhead. She sliced the last rope with a shard of glass, slapping the colt's hindquarters. The animal bolted free, nearly knocking her down. Samuel caught her by the waist just as the roof gave way. They fell together into the snow outside, coughing, shaking. The barn collapsed behind them, a roaring thunder of sparks. For a moment, none of them moved. Then Thomas flung himself into his father's arms, sobbing. Li Mei knelt beside them, trembling. Samuel looked at her, really looked, and saw a courage so quiet it broke something inside him. By dawn, the fire was nothing but smoke and blackened beams. Samuel's hands were blistered. His coat smelled of ash. He moved like a man carved hollow, staring at what little remained. Li Mei stood behind him, wrapped in a blanket, her hair tangled but her eyes fierce with life. She reached for his sleeve, tugging softly. He turned. She pointed toward the sky, then to the ground, then to his chest, her way of saying we live. He nodded, though his face carried the shadow of loss. "We do," he murmured. When the sun climbed higher, neighbors came riding. They dismounted with cautious sympathy, their faces pale in the smoke. One man clapped Samuel on the back. "Heard you lost the barn." "Shame, Whitaker." "Heard tell that Pike fellow was seen near your place last night." Samuel's jaw clenched. "I know who did it." "Want us to ride after him?" He shook his head slowly. "Not yet." His gaze slid to Li Mei, who stood holding Thomas's hand, soot marking her cheek like war paint. Her shawl, scorched at the edge, fluttered in the breeze. "He'll come back," Samuel said, voice low. "And when he does, I'll be ready." The men exchanged glances, uneasy. They'd seen the look in his eyes before, the same look men wore when grief hardened into resolve. That night, the cabin felt smaller without the barn's shadow beside it. The horses that survived were tied near the fence. Samuel repaired what he could, moving methodically, refusing rest. Li Mei cleaned the cuts on his hands with cool water. He hissed as the sting hit, but she didn't flinch. When she wrapped the bandage, her fingers lingered a moment longer than needed. He met her gaze. In the silence, the storm outside whispered through the pines, and something in that stillness softened. He spoke quietly, uncertain if she'd understand. "You saved my boy." She looked confused, then smiled faintly as if sensing the gratitude beneath the words. "Thomas," she said, pointing toward the sleeping child by the hearth. "Family." Her voice trembled over the English syllables. He almost smiled. "Yes," he said. "Family." Later, when the fire burned low, Samuel sat alone at the table. The lamp's light caught the edge of a torn envelope beside him, the letter Harold Pike had sent months ago to order his bride. The broker's handwriting was clean, impersonal, listing her qualities like those of livestock. He stared at it for a long time before tossing it into the flames. The paper curled, blackened, then vanished into smoke. Li Mei watched from the doorway. Her hands were folded before her chest, her expression unreadable. She didn't ask what he had burned. She didn't need to. When he finally rose, she moved aside, allowing him to pass. But as he did, her hand brushed his sleeve, a fleeting contact like the ghost of forgiveness. The next morning, a pale calm settled over the valley. Samuel harnessed the surviving horse to the wagon and drove to town, the road rutted and muddy with melt. He left Li Mei and Thomas behind, promising to return before nightfall. The ride was long and heavy with thought. At the general store, conversation stopped when he entered. He could feel every eye on him. Harold Pike sat at a corner table, smirking. "Heard about your little fire, Whitaker?" he said loudly. "Shame about the barn. Maybe the China woman got careless with the stove." Samuel didn't reply. He walked to the counter, paid for nails and lamp oil. But when Pike rose and said, "You best keep her tied closer next time," Samuel turned. The punch came fast, cracking against Pike's jaw. The man staggered back into the barrel of flour. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. Samuel stood over him, breathing hard. "If you ever come near my land again," he said, voice steady, "you'll leave it in the ground." Then he left, his shadow stretching long across the snow. When he returned home, dusk had turned the world blue. Li Mei met him at the door, worry softening her face. She saw the blood on his knuckles and took his hands without asking. Gently, she washed them again, her touch lighter this time. Neither spoke. Afterward, she brought out a small box from her trunk, the only thing she'd carried from China. Inside was a folded scrap of red silk embroidered with gold thread. She held it out to him, motioning toward the burned barn, then to his chest. He realized what she meant. She wanted to help him rebuild. "You've done enough," he said, but she shook her head firmly. "Together," she said, her voice breaking on the word. The next days passed in rhythm. They worked side by side, cutting wood, driving nails, rebuilding the fences. Thomas fetched water and handed them tools. The cabin, once quiet, filled with the sounds of living again. Each evening they shared bread and tea by the fire. Sometimes Samuel caught himself watching the curve of her smile in the lamplight, the way she tilted her head when listening to the wind. The townsfolk still whispered, but less now. Martha Whitaker returned one afternoon, bringing a new wool coat for Li Mei. "The town will talk no matter what," she said to her son. "Let them talk about courage instead." Samuel nodded, his eyes drifting to Li Mei. "That's all she's shown." That night, as the sky deepened to silver, Li Mei sat by the fire sewing something from the red silk. Samuel dozed in his chair, the boy asleep nearby. She looked at the two of them, the man who saved her, the child who trusted her, and for the first time she felt the strange ache of belonging. Outside, an owl called once through the trees. She whispered a prayer in Chinese, folding the fabric carefully. It would be ready soon, a gift for the home they were mending together. Then a sound split the night. A crunch of footsteps on the frozen path. The door handle rattled once, slow and deliberate. Li Mei froze, needle in hand, eyes darting toward the window. Through the thin curtain of frost, a lantern flickered, and behind it, a figure swayed in the snow. Harold Pike had returned. The door quivered under the weight of the knock. Outside, the wind dragged snow across the porch in restless ribbons, whispering through the cracks like a warning. Samuel stirred awake, his instincts sharper than sleep. The lantern burned low, casting thin gold over the room. Li Mei still formed near the hearth. Thomas curled beneath a blanket, unaware of the storm gathering beyond their walls. The second knock was harder, deliberate. Samuel stood, the floorboards creaking under his boots. He reached for the rifle, leaning against the wall, eyes narrowing. Through the frosted pane, a shadow loomed, a man's outline, swaying slightly, a lantern trembling in his hand. Harold Pike's voice bled through the wind. "Open up, Whitaker. We got unfinished business." Samuel's jaw tightened. "You're not welcome here," he said through the door. From the other side came a laugh, thick with whiskey. You took what's mine. Burn my name through the county. Thought I'd just walk away? Li Mei rose slowly, her breath shallow. Her hands clutched the edge of her shawl as if it could keep the dark from getting in. Samuel turned to her, his voice low but steady. Stay with Thomas. She shook her head. No, the single word, fragile yet firm, hung in the air like a vow. Pike kicked the door. The latch splintered, the lantern outside swinging wildly. Snow poured in as Samuel raised the rifle. Pike stumbled inside, his coat torn, his face red with rage and drink. You ruined me, he shouted. You think you can shame me with that foreign whore? Samuel didn't move. The fire crackled behind him, throwing his shadow tall across the wall. Leave, Pike, he said, before you make it worse. Pike spat on the floor, his eyes bloodshot. She was mine by contract. Paid fair and square. Li Mei stepped forward, trembling but unyielding. No, she said softly. Not yours. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned. Pike sneered. You don't belong here. None of your kind do. He swung the lantern in a wild arc, glass shattering against the table. Fire bloomed across the boards, fast and hungry. Thomas woke with a cry. The flames raced up the curtains, smoke thickening in seconds. Samuel lunged, slamming Pike against the wall. The two men crashed through a chair, grappling for the rifle that had fallen between them. The firelight painted them in violent gold. Li Mei grabbed Thomas, dragging him toward the door, coughing as smoke clawed her lungs. But when she looked back, Samuel was losing ground, Pike's hand around his throat, the other groping for the weapon. Without thinking, she turned back into the heat. She seized a burning log from the hearth, swinging it with both hands. Sparks flew as it struck Pike's back. He howled, twisting toward her, but Samuel broke free, slamming his fist into Pike's jaw. The man collapsed to his knees, groaning. Out. Samuel barked, catching Li Mei by the arm. Together they stumbled through the doorway, Thomas clinging to her skirt. Snow met them in a burst of cold mercy. Behind them, the fire roared louder, devouring everything it touched. Pike staggered out after them, smoke pouring from his clothes. He drew a knife, his face twisted in ruin. You'll regret this, Whitaker, he rasped. You and your heathen woman both. Samuel stepped between him and Li Mei. His voice came quiet but deadly. She's not a woman you'll ever speak of again. Pike lunged. The blade caught Samuel's coat, slicing through fabric and skin. Samuel grunted, twisting his arm. The knife clattered into the snow. He struck once, clean and hard. Pike fell backward, the impact cracking through the silence. The man didn't rise. Steam lifted from his coat where the heat met the cold. Samuel stood over him for a long moment, breathing hard. Then he turned toward the house, the fire rising higher, licking through the roof like a beast breaking free. Thomas cried out, "Pa, the house." Samuel knelt, cupping the boy's face. "It's all right, son. We got what matters." Li Mei watched the flames consume the home she had helped build, her expression unreadable. Smoke blurred her eyes until it looked like tears. The red silk she had been sewing earlier fluttered from the porch, catching fire midair before vanishing into the dark. When the roof caved in, a sound like thunder rolled across the valley. For a while no one spoke. Only the crackling and the low whine of wind filled the silence. By dawn, all that remained was ash and snow. Neighbors came riding again, drawn by the glow of ruin. Martha Whitaker arrived among them, her gray shawl whipping in the cold. She climbed down from her wagon and took one look at her son, her grandson, and the trembling woman beside them. Without a word, she opened her arms. Li Mei hesitated only a second before stepping forward. Martha held her tightly, murmuring, "You did good, child. You saved them." Li Mei didn't answer. Her eyes lifted toward the ridge where the first light touched the mountains, soft and gold against the smoke. Later, when the crowd dispersed, Samuel stood beside the ruined chimney. The ground was scattered with charred wood and blackened nails. He turned something over with his boot, a fragment of the stove, still warm. His hand went to the cut on his arm, the blood dried brown. Li Mei came to him quietly, her shawl wrapped close. "You hurt," she said, pointing to his arm. "I've had worse." His voice cracked slightly, exhaustion pulling it thin. "I'll rebuild." She shook her head. "No," her eyes searched his, unflinching. "We rebuild." He looked at her, then really looked, the soot smeared across her skin, the determination beneath her calm. He'd once thought her fragile, a bird too soft for this land. Now he saw what she truly was, a flame that refused to go out. He reached for her hand, rough palm meeting delicate fingers. "You sure?" he asked softly. "This land isn't kind." Her answer came like a whisper of wind over snow. "Kind is not land. Kind is people." Something inside him gave way. The guarded man who had lived half a life since his wife's death felt warmth return to a place long frozen. He nodded, almost smiling. "Then we'll start again." Days later they built a small shelter beside the ruins. The snow melted faster than expected that spring. Together they raised new beams, hammered nails, planted seeds. The townsfolk began to help quietly, lumber from one farm, a wagon load of hay from another. Whispers of scandal faded into respect. By summer the valley bloomed with wildflowers. A new house stood where the ashes had been, smaller but bright, its porch facing the same sunrise. On a quiet evening, Li Mei hung a strip of red fabric over the door, new silk she'd stitched herself, embroidered with a gold crane. Thomas clapped, calling it Mama's lucky flag. Samuel stood beside her, his hand resting over hers as the wind caught the silk, making it dance like fire reborn. The air smelled of earth and pine and promise. He turned to her, his voice roughened by emotion. "You came here on rags, Li Mei. I didn't know then what you were worth." She smiled faintly, tears glimmering like dew. "Worth is not gold," she said. "Worth is heart that stays." He nodded, and for the first time in years, laughter found him. It came low, genuine, like thunder before rain. As dusk deepened, Martha watched them from the porch steps, her eyes soft. The boy chased fireflies through the field, his laughter echoing between the hills. And beneath the vast, forgiving sky, Samuel took Li Mei's hands. There were no vows spoken, no preacher, no witnesses but the wind, but something sacred passed between them all the same. He bent his head and she leaned forward, their foreheads touching. The lantern behind them flickered, catching on the red silk above the door. For a heartbeat, it glowed brighter than the stars. And far down the valley as night crept in, the faint toll of the church bell carried through the air, slow, solemn, beautiful, marking not an ending but the beginning of a life built from ash and grace.